All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 minute past the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started to be respectful of everybody's time. My name is Nicole Dias. I am the TECaN Education Chair. Welcome to the last segment of this year's job search series, Negotiations and Job Offers Didactic, followed by a Q&A. Today's session will be recorded out to all of those who have registered. So if you have not already done so, please register for the session by scanning the QR code that you see on this slide. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions ahead of time for today's session. We have shared those with our speakers today, who have incorporated them into our talk. And if we don't get to any of them, or there are other questions submitted to us via the chat, we will work them into the presentation or afterwards. Our chat is you can chat any of the hosts or co-hosts, which are any of the moderators or speakers today. And so once you hear who the moderators are, you can send your questions directly to them or directly to the speakers. For all of those at the end, we will have a QR code for the post-session evaluation survey, and all those who fill out the survey will get our TECaN and ONTPD job search series handbook and resource guide, in addition to anything that's placed into today's chat. Next slide. All right, so again, welcome, and I'm here to introduce our moderators. We have two wonderful moderators today. First up is Dr. Erin Bergner, who did her residency and her fellowship at Baylor College of Medicine, Texas Children's Hospital in Houston. She's currently an assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma, as well as the fellowship program director and assistant medical director over nutrition. Her interests include mentorship, professional development, nutrition, and human milk. Next up is Dr. Morgan Hill, who did her residency and fellowship at CHOP and is currently an assistant professor of pediatrics at the University of Cincinnati. She's also the medical director of the neonatal follow-up clinic, Good Samaritan Hospital, at the University of Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. Her interests include medical education, simulation, video review, resuscitation, and neonatal follow-up. So with that, I will turn it over to our moderators.
Thank you, Nicole. So just wanted to introduce our wonderful speakers today. So our first is Liz Bonachea. So she is from Miami, Florida, did her residency and fellowship at Nationwide, and then is currently at Nationwide Children's as well. And then our other speaker is Chris Reber. She is from Cincinnati, Ohio, also did her residency and fellowship at Nationwide, and is currently at Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's Hospital. So with that, I will let you guys take it away.
All right, welcome. Pleasure always to talk with TECaN and to be able to collaborate with my former program director, Chris Reber, a mentor of mine, dear friend. Welcome to everybody who's joined us for the session, and also to those joining us later on, but viewing the recording. I know you all are very busy, and being able to spend some time with us is not a small endeavor. So we are going to talk about managing job negotiations. We're going to focus, being that this is TECaN, a bit extra on this first job negotiation, moving from a trainee to an attending, although those who are in early career and may be considering moves from job to job or renegotiating terms of their employment at their current position may glean some great things out of this talk. We're going to be using the chat, as you heard, so if you have questions, please go to that. We'll do a little didactic, then we'll have some time to break out into audience questions for Dr. Reber as somebody who is doing the hiring and negotiating as a division chief, and then we'll talk more about salary equity. All right, let's see if I can drive this operation here. You are seeing what you should be seeing in theory. Okay. So our objectives today, we're going to talk a little bit about understanding your priorities related to that first attending level job. We'll talk about some of the mechanics of any negotiation process of this kind, and then we'll get some insight from the chief's perspective. And then we'll talk about some individual activities that you want to do after today's session to get you prepared for the negotiation. Some of you may already be considering offers. Many of you are in the interview stages of the job hunt. So this is where we are in the season. In case you weren't aware, as you heard a little mention of, this is part of a job search series. There are a number of sessions that are available to you via recording. So I encourage you, if you are earlier in the process, if you are a very eager first or second year fellow, to go back and reference those additional materials. So when we think about negotiation, I want you to think about it by considering first, what does a successful negotiation look like when it's completed? I'm going to teach principles that are based in yes, yes negotiation. So if you are interested in some additional reading, and this is a topic you find interesting, I highly recommend that you check out the book Getting to Yes. And thanks for dropping those links in the chat. There are some specific considerations that came up in the questions issued before the session, things like job hunting with visa considerations. So I highly encourage you to check out those specific videos. So we're looking for a win-win, yes, yes negotiation where everyone leaves the table happy with a great foundation for an ongoing working relationship and you get a job. So I want you to think of this negotiation as different from some of the other negotiations you might have embarked on. This is not a transactional negotiation. So if anyone enjoys buying a car anywhere nearly as much as I do, throw basically everything you have practiced in that setting out the window. Okay, this is not a scenario where job A is identical to job B, and you're going to get the same product in a different location under different terms. You are probably going to need to make significant trade-offs that have major implications for your work-life integration. So being in a city close to family, for example, versus being in a place with the perfect mentorship and resources for your niche. That's a big trade-off. This isn't leather or cloth seats. Okay, so you really want to be thoughtful about these considerations. Distinct from your negotiation with the fine salesperson at the auto dealer, you actually have an ongoing relationship with this individual. So if you come to this negotiation aggressively, entitled, with poor communication skills, you're not just damaging the negotiation for this job offer, you're damaging potentially the entire relationship with this individual. And the community, even in a subspecialty like neonatology, which is the biggest in peds, is still very small. Another difficulty in this type of negotiation versus a transactional negotiation is the anchors or the established precedent is often very opaque. So I can Google what a car would cost, but it's very hard to figure out what a going salary for a person who is double boarded in neo and palliative care, who's coming out of fellowship, looking for a job in the Midwest. What should that look like? And remember that we're talking about negotiating an entire job offer, not specifically a salary. And a lot of times we get very tunnel-minded in thinking about salary and compensation. But remember that despite us caring a lot about salary for good reasons, time and how we spend it is actually the most important commodity in our lives. And there are a ton of things that are important in your job negotiation process that directly impact your success at the type of job you're trying to craft, as well as your job satisfaction and work-life integration. And here is just a set of examples. This is not exhaustive at all, but these things have major impacts in your day-to-day and long-term enjoyment of your job. And they all come up in the negotiation process. So what I will recommend is what I call my rule number 2. This has to do with my personal finance education that I love to give, but also the job search. And you want to reduce your zone of discontent. So if we took a Venn diagram of the perfect job and the job you actually have, everything in the middle is your joy, and everything on the edges is potential for burnout. So all those things you're missing because you don't have, or the things that you hate and you have to deal with. So your job in the negotiation process is try to align the job you want and the job you have as much as you can. So I'm going to issue you a homework assignment. If you will play along, just take out your phone, snap a picture of this, and remember to look at it later. And your homework is to think about what are your top 3 priorities, at least, more if you've got them, in this job search. And think about the big words, so salary, geography, clinical work. But then try to drill down more specifically into what are the things that you as an individual need, want, would love within that category. So you can see some examples here. How do you even consider the importance of geography when you're comparing offers? Maybe you would love to live in a specific city, but it's so expensive you're worried about the trade-offs. Maybe you've got little kids, and if you choose a job in the Midwest, then you have childcare versus in some of those other cities that are already expensive, you're going to be paying for daycare on top of that. And maybe geography also has to do with which programs are the places where I have that great mentorship or that resource, or that is looking for somebody with my specific skill set. We'll just go ahead and get it out front now that this is the weakest negotiation position you'll ever be in your academic career. It's coming right out of fellowship. And yet you do have some specific experiences and skill sets that are distinct from one another, which are going to align better or worse with a given job's resources and priorities. So before we even can talk about contracts and negotiation, you have to know what you want, because then you can prioritize the offers and figure out what's negotiable and what's not, and what's going to leave you happy with the outcome of the negotiation. And if you share your life with a partner, then this is a team sport. You all have to come up with these decisions together. You should never have to defend what you find valuable, but you do need to be aware of the trade-off costs, right? The differences between, say, that job in New York versus the job in the Midwest from geography. I want to introduce a couple of terms. So if you're looking at resources around negotiation, these terms will come up. And they, of course, have acronyms, and we as neonatologists are totally cool with that because we love a good acronym. So BATNAs and ZOPAs. So the BATNA is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So that means if I cannot come to a resolution in this negotiation, what's my best option? Is it to take the contract as is? Is it to walk away and take the other job offer that I have? Is it to go back onto the market and pick up a few more first interviews, hopefully, because I'm not at a place I want to be in this negotiation? So once you have figured out what your BATNA is for the job in general, or for the specific item for which you are negotiating, then your next responsibility is to do your best to figure out what's the other person's BATNA. So if I'm going to ask for more money or a lighter clinical schedule or X, Y, and Z, I've got to think about the person on the other side of the negotiation table. So I've got to think about the division chief or the practice director or manager with whom I am negotiating. What do they need? You know, maybe I want to spend as much of my clinical time doing surgical and ECMO, but what they really need is somebody who's going to go to some of the outlying delivery hospitals. You've got to think about what sort of social or physical capital, money, etc., your ask is going to require. So if you want a higher salary, but you know that they have hired 2 people last year and they're hiring 2 people this year, are they going to be able to give you a higher salary and either compromise the fact that we have equitable offers across the table, which they're honestly not going to do and shouldn't do, or do they need to raise the other salaries in accommodation? That's a big ask. If your ask is, can I not be on service before I take my neo boards for 2 months? That's probably not going to be a big ask, depending on the size of the practice group. And then, is there any precedent for what I'm asking for? So this is where having the opportunity to do some digging and some homework and investigations is really helpful. So if you're able to make contact with folks that have been recently hired into this practice or into this division and figuring out what they have been offered is really useful in your negotiation. So if you know everybody who got hired last year got a sign-on bonus, it's a bit of a stronger position for asking for a sign-on bonus than if you know they hired 2 people earlier this year and nobody got a sign-on bonus. So do your best to consider and investigate what the other person's BATNA is going to be. And within the ranges of the BATNAs, there's actually a series of options which you or your negotiation partner would consider acceptable. That range of mutually acceptable options is the ZOPA, or the zone of possible agreement. So if I'm negotiating with Chris and we're considering salary, I have a certain minimum in mind and Chris has a certain maximum in mind. And theoretically, there might be a zone for which we agree. And you can think of this in the same way for something like clinical service weeks. I've got sort of a goal, my chief or practice manager has a goal. Understand, though, that the zone of possible agreement could be really narrow depending on what the ask is. So for something like clinical service or salary, there may not be a lot of wiggle room in that zone of possible agreement. Versus, an opportunity to have an administrative role, there could be a huge zone of possible agreement of what that would look like. So do your best to consider this a priori before coming to the negotiation. And I want you to think about negotiation broadly. I want you to think about the entire process and not a specific line item. So for example, what if I really love the contract that Chris has offered me and we're entering a negotiation? I would love a little bit more salary, but I know, and she knows, she's not going to be able to offer that because of equity. If I step back and think, well, what is my big picture? It's to be a program director. Well, then I can think of a series of things I could potentially negotiate for that could help me in that ambition to be a program director for. I could be negotiating how I spend my clinical time. I could be negotiating for a specific administrative role. I could be negotiating for division level funds to be able to go to educator conferences, maybe above and beyond what all faculty have in their enrichment funds. Maybe I'm going to negotiate for time to get a master's in medical education. And certainly I can ask for a salary increase, but I need to be cognizant of the fact that that might not be on the table for consideration. And maybe I have in my mind a backup plan to say, okay, maybe if salary is not something we can budge on, maybe there's an opportunity to get a sign-on bonus because I have to relocate to the fine state of Texas to be able to work at this job. And that sounds expensive. So remember that if the goal is win-win, you have to think really broadly about what you're trying to achieve. Unfortunately, in win-win negotiation, private information is the worst possible setup. Okay? So the more transparency you have, the easier it is to reach a win-win negotiation. And in a scenario where nobody knows each other's badness, where we're all operating on different timelines and we don't necessarily understand the other party's timeline, we don't know what previous hires have been offered or successfully negotiated for, and we don't even know what's technically on the table to negotiate. That can put you in a weak negotiation position. So what I want to encourage you to do is seek transparency and seek as much private information as you can. And I'll give you some ideas and scripts of how to ask questions pointedly to get at this. For everything you're considering bringing up in a negotiation, you have to think about ahead of time. How important is this to me? There are some things that may truly be non-negotiable, and you may have to walk away from an excellent job offer. And your job is going to be how to do that in as respectful a manner as humanly possible to preserve that relationship. But something may truly be non-negotiable, and that's okay. For things that are a high priority, think about what data do I have to back up my ask or that helps me better understand their positions. I can certainly walk in and say, I'd love to be paid $500,000, but is that founded in any meaningful information or not? So it's up to me to do a little due diligence to figure that out ahead of time. Have I made my ask as specific as possible? So I need to understand enough about the setup of a practice or a job to be able to say, I would love to do as much of my level 2 service at all Christopher's at this location, because I've done my homework. I know exactly how this practice is set up. I know their sites, and there is a rationale why I want to be at that particular level too. And so be specific. And then for each negotiation element, think about what am I hoping to achieve? What would be cool, if not perfect? What could I live with? And then think about it from their perspective and think about creative win-win solutions that help both of you. So here's some examples of what that could look like. So you've got these different pockets of things you could be negotiating to discuss. And maybe salary benefits is truly important for you. Well, maybe they can't increase your salary, but maybe they can give you a sign-on bonus or a relocation bonus that will help you get your feet wet in a new environment. Sure, it sounds great to do a little less clinical time than say 20 weeks or 24 weeks or whatever the baseline is, but it would be inequitable to offer you less than other people in the same rank and administrative position. But it's possible that instead of negotiating for less clinical time, you can have some flexibility of where you rotate. So that would be something that you could bring up with your practice manager or chief. Okay. What does an offer actually look like? So some of you may have one in hand that you can sort of bounce this structure off of. Some of you are in the interview process. So here are the basics. Every contract or offer letter should have terms of the employment, some level of information about the work schedule, but I will go ahead and scoop you now that it may be far vaguer than you would like it to be. It should indicate compensation, so salary, some semblance of how that salary is calculated based on different structures that I'll show you in a second. And any productivity expectations, particularly if those are directly hinged to your salary. It will describe how your malpractice insurance is covered, what type of insurance, and it should describe to what quantity you are covered. And then you will have a section in most contracts, if not all, except for 5 states currently, related to non-competes or other restrictive covenants. So I do want to go ahead and disclose, as I describe what those covenants are, that there is current legal action to dissolve this practice. I'll describe that more in a second. So total compensation. A lot of times we think of this as your annual salary, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. So usually when you're looking at data reference sources for total compensation, we're talking about salaries, supplements, and bonuses. It generally will exclude your benefits package, but it's important for you to note that depending on how the benefits package of a given job is structured, that can actually be substantial dollars in your pocket, whether it's now or in the future. So for example, my employer will provide 10% of the salary in a retirement account. I can't spend that today, but that's a considerable financial remuneration that I have to take into account. So we're talking about contractual salary. There may be fixed supplements, though this is more typical when you are achieving higher leadership positions. So for example, if you're a medical director or division chief, there may be a supplement paid for those roles. And then there may be an incentive or bonus structure. So consider a few setups here. You may have one type of job where you are paid a flat salary, and that includes all of your clinical, if you have research and educational expectations, that's in there too. It includes all of your call as well. And then there may be an opportunity to earn some fairly small bonuses on top of that flat salary. There are other institutions where you are paid a specific salary, and then you are paid some additional amount for some of your call. Either all of your call is paid per diem or per shift, or you have sort of a minimum expectation, and then extra call on top of that is paid as moonlighting. And you may have a bonus structure that, let's say, this job is a little bit more generous than the other bonus structure. You can also have jobs in neonatology where you paid a flat salary, but then you are paid a more significant revenue sharing bonus. This type of structure is more common in private practices, where depending on how much revenue the practice generates, you're going to get a larger bonus, typically once a year, that covers some of that revenue sharing. So you've got to understand the terms and how it differs from one job to another. Another important element of the contract are the terms of employment. So it should stipulate how long the contract is in force. So is this a 1-year contract, a 3-year contract? What are the timings in terms of when that contract is going to be reevaluated or renegotiated? It will include stipulations about who can break the contract and under what conditions. So for example, terminated for cause or at will. Some of these things are regulated by your state law. So for example, I'm living in Ohio. Ohio is an at-will employment state. Meaning that they can terminate you without cause. You need to understand what type of malpractice your contract covers. So the 3 major models are occurrences, so meaning if something happens while you are employed, regardless of when the suit is brought, you're covered. This is super important in neonatology because we have very little to any statute of limitations. So that lawsuit could be brought when a child has now reached even adulthood. So if you were not covered under occurrence malpractice, then there may be a squabble over who is covering that incident. The other 2 models, most commonly claims made, and claims paid is very rare. So claims made means that not only does the harm need to occur, the incident need to occur while you're employed by this practice, the lawsuit also needs to be raised during that interval of time. If you have this type of insurance in your contract, this is critical for you to understand, because somebody needs to pay what is referred to as your tail, which is if an incident happened during your term of employment, but the claim is brought much later, who's responsible for paying that? And in many circumstances, the answer is you. This is particularly common in private practice arrangements, so certainly not exclusive. So you need to know which type of insurance and who's responsible for the tail. And then restrictive covenants are really important to understand. So a non-compete arrangement is basically a restriction from seeking employment at a competitor of your current employer for a given period of time. So for example, a non-compete could say you are not allowed to work for any other employer within 50 miles of this institution for 5 years after you have left employment or been terminated from employment with us. Some of these have really short durations, some are really long, some have a very narrow radius, so just the most immediate competitor. Some can be very broadly written. Some will actually stipulate exact institutions that are competitors that you cannot work for. Non-competes, as you can imagine, can be quite cumbersome, if not potentially prohibitive of being able to stay in a given city, for example, and maintain your livelihood. there was actually a rule instituted by the Federal Trade Commission that said that non-competes are illegal. It was instituted in January 2023, and any further decisions on this policy have been pushed off to 2024. But there are 5 states that have already made non-competes illegal. So you need to understand whether a non-compete is present in your contract, whether it's enforceable in your states, and what are the implications should you be interested at some point of breaking this non-compete. It is a very costly process, but technically you can go through the court system to defend or technically to beat a non-compete agreement. So make sure before you enter negotiations that you understand that contract or the offer details. So if you have to pay that tail, not only do you know that you are the one who's going to pay it, but do you know how much that costs? So it's one thing to say like, yeah, I'll take care of that if it comes up, but we're talking about the tail insurance in the tens of thousands, right? This is not a cheap product. You need to understand this before you enter the negotiation. There's nuances that you may not have thought about now, but as you have conversations with the faculty in your interviews, these are important things to talk about. So for example, if you take a caregiver leave, how is that actually covered? It's easy to say like, oh yeah, you can take 12 weeks of leave if you have a baby, but how does the salary work? What happens to my clinical service? So is my FTE or my expectation for clinical work decreased in that situation? Or do I just have to shift things around where I'm basically doing the same amount of clinical time in 9 months instead of 12 months? Are you still eligible for a bonus if you take a leave of absence, for example? We talked about the non-competes. Do you understand parameters for things like a bonus? So while there's typically not a lot of financial discussions at first interviews, it's perfectly appropriate to ask for some details for things like, can you send me your documents that cover promotion and tenure on this track that I'm interested in a job for? Can you send me any information you have on your revenue sharing agreements in this private practice? What does a bonus algorithm look like in your division? And can you send me any materials about your benefits so you can begin to explore all of these? And what is really important to you may be slightly different than what is really important for somebody else, for things such as caregiver leave, or depending on your health status, the insurance coverage could be really important to you. So seek out all this information before you enter the negotiation process. Do you need a lawyer? Okay, maybe. It's a solid maybe, and maybe an error towards possibly to probably. The main thing to consider about lawyers with employment contracts is that it's probably more valuable to you in helping you understand the contract than being the one to drive the negotiation. It's really important that you understand enough of the contract language to know what you're agreeing to. What are you agreeing to as far as a non-compete? What are you agreeing to as far as termination clauses? If you leave the job within the first year or two, what happens to the sign-on bonus that they gave you? If they have student loan repayment, what happens to that money if for whatever reason you have to leave that job? And it's not to say that you would take the job or not, depending on the answer, but you need to know what you've agreed to. Some contracts for employment in medicine are incredibly dense legalese. Some are actually written in plain language. So even from job to job, there may be a differential need to get a lawyer to help you understand that. Some institutions do offer resources to support you. So your GME office or your hospital's legal office may have some degree of contract assistance. They may have some physician experts that are able to show you example contracts and help you with this process. If you, for whatever reason, though, think that you are at higher risk than average of needing to break a contract, you definitely need a lawyer. So here's an example of what that could look like. What if you have the dream job? This is the job you've wanted since before medical school. This is like your hometown practice. You love it. They're not hired. So you go into this process knowing, gosh, it would be great if I could get a job at that institution, but it's just not in the cards. What would you do if you suddenly knew, as you had already signed an employment contract, that that dream job is now available? Okay, so you'd have to try to investigate at that point, are you able to break this contract and what are the implications for breaking it? So that's a scenario where 100% you need to get a lawyer involved. Okay, what does this cost? It could be as little as $500 because most lawyers are going to charge by the hour. So if you have a very straightforward contract and a straightforward discussion with the lawyer, it could be a couple hours billable work. But it could certainly run you a few thousand. And if you actually wind up in a very complex situation, like trying to break an employment contract, it could be even more. I got a question about which states non-compete arrangements are illegal. It's actually growing. I forget exactly who's done the final steps, but a minimum of California, Colorado, Illinois, and then I think Virginia and Washington. But if anybody wants to Google really quick and drop that in the chat, those are the ones that sound familiar to me. And as I said, there will be a national shakeup on this issue probably within the next year. So I urge you to keep an ear out or set a Google alerts for new articles with the terms non-compete, illegal, or something to that effect. Okay, so now we're going to get into it. We're going to talk about the ground rules of the negotiation. So when you have received an offer, remember niceties and graciousness. I'm super excited to review this offer. I would love to have a discussion about some of the details in the contract. And now you're going to establish with whom, how, and when the negotiation is going to occur. Okay, so who is the person I'm talking to? Are we going to have a phone call? Are we going to hop on Zoom? Is there a formal second visit where we're going to talk about some of the details of the contract? Less ideally telephone, probably least ideal email, because a lot gets lost in the back and forth of written tone. Okay. Understand that there are going to be potentially some items that you are talking to the person who has the full discretion to agree or disagree to the ask. But there may be some things that they need to go on and discuss with a research center director or the chair or somebody else in the practice infrastructure. I recommend that you negotiate all of your asks simultaneously. So again, this isn't the car negotiation. You're not pulling the whole haggle the price back and forth. And as soon as they think we've reached an agreement, you're like, and now I want the all-weather mats. By the way, I highly encourage that technique. Always works. Always get those free all-weather mats. But don't do that to your future employer. So give them the broad picture of what you're looking to achieve in that first conversation. Don't negotiate just because it's fun, which it can be. But really come to the table with a negotiation. Now, you will not win any race that you do not enter, but you're not haggling just for the sake of haggling. Okay? It's absolutely okay to talk about time. This is the number one concern that fellows have, is will this offer just like disappear like an exploding letter in the next 10 minutes if I don't answer it? Okay? We'll talk about how to ask about timelines. And then remember that you'll want your leaders to care about equity. So if you're coming in there thinking, well, I'm going to get the best salary and I'm going to get the least clinical time and I'm going to be the winner of the practice, that's probably not a well-run practice if you can achieve that. At the same time, though, make sure you know your worth. So while you are in, again, the weakest negotiation position, you do have some specific skills and expertise that are valuable. What would you actually say, though? This all sounds good in practice. Again, you don't need to use any of these, but people have often asked for some examples. So what could a script of negotiating for an item be? You can say, I would like to request whatever it is I'm requesting. Why? This really aligns well with my career goals to do blah, 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 blah. And this would be an important first step to a leadership opportunity. Okay, so be specific about the ask and give an explanation why. Here's another example. You're looking for a relocation bonus. So you are requesting a one-time relocation bonus. You put a specific dollar figure in mind. There is maybe some literature to say that a range might be superior to a number, where the low end of the range is the number you actually want. Particularly in academic practices, there's very little wiggle room here for equity reasons across an entire department. But there is some literature behind the idea of a range. And then give an explanation. I've actually sought out cost estimates, and that's what's going to cost to move from Ohio to Texas. And that's why I'm asking for the specific number. Use a lot of clarifications. So can you please clarify expectations for call and service makeup for caregiver leave? These are good things to do before you actually sit down to the formal negotiation step. Can you clarify what the impacts of a leave would be on the annual bonus? A lot of times with these scripts, less is more. Be polite, but don't ramble and don't go into this weird apologetic cycle. Read it, send it to a friend, get feedback, trim it, read it, trim it, read it. If you need some time to think about the element, and that's different, I'll talk to you about time as far as juggling various offers and interviews, but if you just need some time to think about this element that is part of the negotiation, just say, I'd like to take some time to think creatively about this. I want to be part of meeting your needs too. Can we speak again in 2 weeks? This is also good if you just know that you're on service and you're swamped and you just need a little bit of time to think more. But far and away, the thing that causes the most stress and ulceration is juggling offers. So you will probably send out all of your CVs and cover letters for the first wave at a specific time, but then you're going to hear back from practices and divisions at very different timelines. So there are going to be some timelines where they already know they're hiring, and as soon as an exciting CV cover letter hits the table, the process is moving. There's going to be some times where you're going to send your materials to a practice manager or chief who's going to say, I don't know if I'm hiring. I'm going to put this in the pile. I'll get back to you. Or I think I'm going to be hiring. I'll have more information in a month, 2 months, whatever that time is. Okay. So when you have these different time cycles, that can be incredibly distressing. You may at some point have 2 offers in hand at the same time. If you have 2 offers in hand at the same time, the first thing that you have to do is try your best to make sure that you are comparing apples to apples. So FTEs and clinical time, the language behind those elements are very different from job to job. So make sure you are comparing them in an accurate way. It's okay to reference an element of a competing offer in your negotiation worded respectfully, but understand that it may be completely irrelevant to the person on the other side of the negotiation table. You might say, oh, I've got a salary offer for this place in the Midwest that is desperate for neonatologists. And Chris might say, that's just not the scenario we're in, and that's not something that we can match or are willing to match. Make sure that when you have multiple offers that you clarify timelines and stick to them. I know you're busy. I get it. We were talking before the session started about how behind we all always are on email. Trust me, but these are messages you do not want to reply late to. Okay? So be very clear when they need to hear back from you, and whatever you have said you would do, stick to it. And then remember that everybody has put a lot of time and energy into recruiting you. And that's everybody from the administrator who organizes your interview day, all the faculty who take time to meet with you, the chief or practice manager who's negotiating with you. They're all very much invested in this process, and they deserve your respect. Such that once you have made a decision, if you have multiple offers on the table, please be very prompt and straightforward when you have made a decision. Do not leave the fish on the line, okay? Here are some example scripts for things that people have been distressed about as far as timing. So the first one is just, how do I open the door to negotiation? I'm very excited to review your offer in detail. How and when would you like to discuss any clarifying questions or requests? So now in the back of your mind, you're not panicking of how fast do I need to get back to them, because you just asked, when do you need to hear from me? And now this is a jumping off point for your discussions. Be transparent. You can say, thank you so much for this offer. I'm so excited to review it. I do have one more first visit next week. Do you have a specific timeline for when you need to discuss the terms of this offer? And I hope that most people are going to be equally transparent and respectful with you. They might say, we have several excellent candidates, although we're very excited about you, we really do need a decision here in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And that's fine. Now you can decide how you feel about that. Once you have decided to not take a job, go ahead and break up in a nice way. Okay, so maybe you're still in the negotiation process with them. You haven't gotten the offer. You're between first and second visits, for example. So you could say, at this point in the process, I need to withdraw my application. I recognize all the work that went into reviewing your candidates and setting up interviews, and I'm really appreciative of the effort. If you have gotten deep in the process, like even had an offer, then in my opinion, and not everybody feels this way, in my opinion, I think it's nice to just go ahead and tell them that you've accepted a position elsewhere, and go ahead and say where. We all know it's not a big community. We know where you're at. But again, show that gratitude for the opportunity, and understand that at some point you may be looking for another job. And either it's in the same place with the same person, or maybe that person has moved on to a new place. So being able to preserve that relationship for future negotiation opportunities is key. All right, now it is your chance to interrogate the person on the other side of the negotiation table, either in hypothetical or in actuality. So I am going to let y'all go to the chat and ask questions. You can send them to the moderators, you can send them to me, we will all be able to see. But I will start us with a little bit of a warm-up question. For those who have just started the interview process or maybe are still looking for some interviews, what are some things that you love to hear from a candidate during the one-on-one with you in particular, versus things that they should be talking to other faculty about?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, all the questions are for you now.
Oh, okay. So for me specifically, I think definitely some of the details that you had mentioned, like what does the job look like at Texas Children's Hospital, Baylor College of Medicine? So what does it look like? What are you looking for in a candidate? Those are the types of questions. So high level to begin with, I think is really important. Certainly you wouldn't start the conversation with, what will my salary be, or those types of things. But I think really it's a lot like a fellowship interview in the sense that you want me to be excited about you as a candidate. So I really want to hear that there's a genuine interest in hearing about my program, because if I want to bring you in, I want you to be excited about joining our faculty and joining this program. So I think it's also spending that time to make sure you do know what you about that institution, and have some very pointed questions about that institution, and then kind of those high level questions to begin with.
Right. So in your experience now in multiple places doing hiring, what are the things that tend to be more easily negotiable, and what are the things that are either impossible or harder to negotiate?
So I'm going to come at it with I'll say it both ways, I guess. So assuming that most folks on this call are either just out of fellowship or very early in their career, there's not a lot to negotiate in terms of clinical time, in terms of salary. Benefits are almost non-negotiable, right? So your benefits come from your academic institution. So I don't have, there's even that extra added layer of it's our academic institution, not the hospital. So benefits are almost never negotiable. I think, like Liz said, if you're getting a lot of wiggle room in terms of clinical time and salary, that should concern you a little bit early in your career, because that means that somebody else who's coming in may be getting more than you are actually, right? Or less, right? And I'm always very transparent about that and say I make sure that our salaries are equitable. And then there is more negotiation room if you do have a specific talent as you get further along in your career. So as you start to negotiate later in your career, you will have specific talents that you're trying to match with that site where you're interviewing, and so there will be more room for negotiation. You said non-competes. That's the one question, and I worry sometimes that's almost always the question that lawyers ask candidates to ask, and it's almost always non-negotiable. I mean, I have never heard of it being negotiable. So if anybody knows otherwise, let me know. But I've never heard of non-competes being negotiable. And as you can imagine, if they negotiate with one candidate, then it basically leaves them open to it falling apart with another lawsuit, right? So non-competes are essentially non-negotiable. Negotiable. I didn't answer that question. Go ahead, Erin.
Okay. Just as long as you're on the track of kind of what to negotiate, we had several things that came through the chat or through the pre-question on specific things and can this or this be negotiated. So one of them was the date of employment part of the contract, is your start date essentially.
Yes, and in fact, my head was spinning this past year because I hired, I think we hired total 8 faculty, and they all were starting on different dates. And my head was spinning because I wanted to do a welcome party, and my welcome party is October 9th, because so many people were scattered throughout the 3 months. So so it is negotiable for the most part.
If I could just jump in on that, one thing that you have to consider, first of all, if you negotiate a delayed start date, understand you're not getting paid.
True.
And your pay may then be 2 to 4 additional weeks delayed from your start date, depending on where you pick up a pay cycle and how often you're getting paid. So understand, again, the exact specifications for that and plan ahead of time, please, for that employment gap. Also think carefully about the insurance gap. And so that's another reason to be very thoughtful about what your start date is going to be. There are options like COBRA that can bridge really any logical gap that people would take between fellowship and attending. You can have COBRA for up to 18 months, I believe, but it's not cheap. So particularly if you know you're going to have significant healthcare needs during that time period between fellowship and attending, that's super important to think about in your start date.
That's a great point, Liz. And I think that to go along with that, so for example, we had some faculty who were staying here at Baylor, and that had different implications for them, right? Because they were suddenly stopping a contract and starting a new contract, and some of their benefits were gonna lose some of their benefits. So yeah, make sure you understand what that gap means to you personally based on where your job.
Sage advice, very good advice. The other specific one was on loan repayment options. Are those typically something that's offered? And how would it be received if someone was asking for a loan repayment in their negotiations?
Well, you should always ask, but it's more than likely a policy of that institution, whether they provide loan repayment, but you certainly should ask, you can ask the question. Neither of the institutions where I have worked offer loan repayment, but I'm sure there are some that might, depending on their need.
Not incredibly common in neonatology. It's skewed more towards the private practices. But again, the most important thing to know about that are what the terms are if you leave the practice. So what will you owe to whom? How does it impact your, is this a refinance of your loans into a new loan? Or is it money that's going directly from the employer to your student loan payor? Is it money that goes to you that then goes to the student loan company, which may have tax implications? So you've really got to understand the nuances of that.
And then somewhat related to kind of what to negotiate, I have a couple questions on the all important salary in terms of negotiations. So I had a question on what is a realistic salary range for a starting attending, both private and academic, and is there any source to go to find that information?
Put a pin in that one. I'll come to that in a little bit.
Okay.
I was going to say that there's a lot of, yes, a lot of variables in the answer to that question.
Perfect. And then Liz touched on this just a little bit, but I just want to maybe more emphasize that people had questions on how flexible are your compensation negotiations, and is that different between a private and an academic position?
Yes, I would say there's less room for negotiation regardless of whether it's private or academic if you're just starting out, because they're gonna have their sliding scale. It's just like starting any other job. They're gonna have their where they're starting their faculty, and you can imagine if you have where you're starting your faculty and you're suddenly being asked to increase that by $10,000, that has implications for a lot of other things, right? So there's much less room when it is a faculty member who's just graduated from fellowship. Be careful to make sure you ask, and Liz already said some of this, but you need to make sure you get in the weeds with, do you pay extra for call, right? So we pay extra for in-house call. So our overall salary may look lower than other institutions, but you also get another, $30,000, $40,000 in call pay, right? Now, call pay is different, taxed differently than base salary, right? And so you just have to take all those considerations in as you're thinking about it. But it does have implications for your salary. It also gives you the flexibility of doing more or less call too, right? So there's all those nuances that you need to ask as you're asking questions of the chief.
Another nuance I would add to that is like to your base salary would be paying attention to where your benefits or your retirement contributions from the institution are coming from, because if you have a base salary that's this and it's X% of your base salary, it's going to affect what those institutional retirement benefits are too. So just it's different every institution, so just pay attention to it.
Yep.
So
sure.
That's wonderful advice on salary. I know we had several questions on some contracts reviews and lawyers. So I was going to turn that over to Morgan to ask those.
So Liz, I know you did a really kind of beautiful job talking a little bit about kind of timeline of things and like appropriate etiquette and maybe some scripts of kind of how to throw the ball back in their court. But some of the questions we got were like, say, considering they throw the ball in your court, how long is it okay to ask for when considering a job offer? How long is too long? And other just general recommendations on timeline.
Sure. I mean, how long is too long is something to do with when you start the process, right? I think we can all agree that all employers and employees would love to have this locked up. Ideally, I would say March is when most people are getting incredibly antsy about the fact that they have not finalized their employment scenario, but everybody is on different timelines. So there's sort of a hard stop. Obviously, you do not want to graduate fellowship without a job. So that puts some boundaries around the conversation. I think it's very rare that you're not going to get something back from the person you're negotiating with. They're not trying to be coy for fun. So they can say, we're early on in the process. We have lots of flexibility. What sort of timeline works for you? In which case, I would just supply useful information. I'd say, Dr. Reber, I have a first visit scheduled at one more institution next month, and I have been invited to do a second visit in November at this other institution. Would it be reasonable for me to get back to you after I've completed those two visits, or would you need to know something sooner?
Yeah.
So that way you still have some flexibility kind of worked into the conversation.
It gets really, really tricky with graduating fellows because they are starting to contact me the spring of their second year, right? And so I'm trying to navigate literally a lot of emails from fellows who are graduating and the timeline of what, right? And then this often doesn't align with our academic institution's budget in terms of being approved for official positions. So you have to, I think, presume innocence, right? I mean, I wouldn't assume, well, they must not be interested in me because this is taking forever, right? I try to relay that to everybody that this is what's happening. But in terms of timeline, this isn't, me sending an email and saying, hey, we're going to offer you a job. That I would never renege on that without letting you know that. But if it takes too long for me to hear an offer and I've got other people waiting who want to accept another job, but they'd rather come here, that's what happens, right? I would reach out to you and say, hey, I'm going to offer this to somebody else if you can't commit, right? Because I have to fill my faculty position. So you just know that the chiefs are navigating a lot of balls in the air and a lot of candidates coming and going and trying to interview. And I try to just be as transparent as possible and say, when can you get back to me? And the other piece is, if I offer you a job, it takes a long time to get a contract drawn up, right? It has to go through so many different layers. And so it doesn't mean that I'm not being responsive or that Baylor's not being responsive. It's just that it has to get signed by umpteen million people and go to compensation and blah, blah, blah. So, and I also try to relay that too. But I think just keep communicating with the chief. That is my advice, is keep an open line of communication with the chief. This is the person you're going to be working with, right, in the future. So you want to have a good relationship with he or she. So it's fine to keep talking to them.
There's an important element to a layer of complexity when it's not just your job that you're exploring and negotiating for. So if you are in a 2-physician couple, working between prospective employers or even between institutions, let's say it's an adult job and a pediatric job together, adds a lot of complexity to the process and to the timelines. If you have a spouse who's not in medicine, who has specific job opportunities in a city, but maybe their interview timeline is very different from what you're looking like, that just, again, ups the ante to be very clear in your communication and very transparent, saying, you know, I'm super excited about this job. My partner is still interviewing and really looking to find a position that's going to meet our needs. I understand that you have a timeline as well, so please let me know if you need to make a decision sooner rather than later. But I would love, you know, the opportunity to have another couple of months for my partner to be on the job search, something to that effect. And usually when it's two partners in medicine, there's a lot of behind the scenes crosstalk. So between prospective employers, between the department chairs, you know, the folks that need to be involved to help try to smooth this process.
One more question about timeline of negotiations that came up in the chat, which is a little bit more specific. And someone was asking if they say, hey, you have 2 weeks to reply back to this offer letter. Does that generally mean 2 weeks to reply with negotiations and things that you want to talk about? Does that mean 2 weeks until you need to say, yes, I'm accepting or no? Or again, is that just totally variable and you just need to keep open communication?
Just keep an open communication, because I wouldn't know what that meant, right? If I read it being even a division chief. So I think it's responding back and saying, I'm really excited about this offer. But can you give me more details? What exactly do you need to know? I would like, and you could say in there, I want to meet with a lawyer just to, you know, somehow delay that, and my meeting won't be until X. Can I then get back with you at such and such date to talk about the offer? And then that kind of delays things a little bit. So, but you're having an open line of communication.
And again, don't be frivolous about it, right? Don't delay just for the sake of delaying. But if you have a clear reason why you need to do that, then just say so.
Yeah, I agree.
It was a great kind of segue into a lawyer question that we received too. You had touched on this a little bit before, Liz, of kind of how to find and select an attorney. Someone mentioned that the AAP partnered with a firm called Resolve and was wondering if you guys recommend that at all. And also was recommending or questioning if you guys recommend that the attorney that they partner with is also located in their same state of intended employment.
Yeah, so I think the two most important things when you're actually looking for a lawyer, just in sort of qualifications, would be somebody in the state where the job is located, because there are some important state specific nuances here, like the terms of employment at will. And again, if their job is to explain what you are agreeing to, they need to be able to do that in the context of the local law. It is a nice bonus, though I wouldn't say essential, to have somebody who specializes in physician contracts, because they can give you a much better sense of like, these things are usually negotiable, these are not, versus somebody who's more of a general employment attorney. The best place to find one of these folks is a peer recommendation. So 100% hands down, somebody who's worked with the lawyer, can give you an idea what they paid, who has said, you know, this person was very receptive, was prompt, right? Because this can be really important when we're navigating what could be potentially tight timelines. Like I was able to do a quick conversation for introductions and then set up our formal meeting within a week. That would be far superior to somebody who you're chasing by email for 2 months. There are several physician organizations that have recommended lawyers. So those are good places if you have sort of analysis paralysis or you don't have anybody who's giving you a peer reference. But understand that those are sometimes wrapped up in conflicts of interest and things like that. So best case scenario is somebody that you know and trust has worked with a lawyer. And a lot of GME offices kind of collect this informally. So reaching out to them may be a place to make that connection.
Great. So another thing that we wanted to ask you guys questions about were a little bit more of kind of the nuances of how to negotiate. I think, again, you did a really good job covering like what are some of the kind of negotiable things, but some of the questions focused on like, how exactly do you ask for that? What's the rate etiquette? How many of these things can you ask for and kind of in what way?
I'll tell you what not to do is to write a letter or an email with a list of things and then send it to, any number of people. That's probably the worst case scenario. But again, asking whoever is making you the job offer, like, how do you want to proceed? And then understand that there are probably some things that you need to clarify before the negotiation that may or may not be best done by that person. So sometimes they will say, if you have questions about the benefits or the this or that, this is a person to talk to. Sometimes they're actually formally part of your interview process. So you may know that there's certain clarifications that could go to that person. I met the business manager. They were the ones who explained all this stuff to me about the bonus and and I want to clarify a few things with them. That's fine too. I personally have a major preference for face-to-face, which obviously could include virtual options, because it allows you much more nuance and it allows the conversation to be more efficient than a back and forth and back and forth and back and forth by email. And I think when tone gets misinterpreted, that can go awry really fast. So those are my preferences of how to do it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think being thoughtful about, I don't want to discourage anybody for advocating for themselves. This is your contract and your job. You should definitely advocate for yourself. But I have to be really honest, when people are asking for things, when I say, okay, you're being hired for a full clinical FTE, and here's what a full clinical FTE looks like at Texas Children's Hospital, and you're going to be in alignment with 15 other faculty, right? And they're saying, well, I don't want to work any Saturdays and I don't want to, and I really need 2 less weeks, right? That makes you as a chief go, well, okay, are you a team player or, you know what I mean? So I think, and I have had some negotiations that have not gone well just because I do want, and I'll be the first to say, advocate for yourself, but you're also a part of a team. So I'm going to be very transparent about what your team is doing, and that you're not going to do more than what your team members are doing. So I think keep some of that in mind as you are negotiating, because I think I do want to hire team players, right? I want to hire folks who really want to be part of the team and help each other out.
Yeah, and to that, I will reemphasize the importance of the why. So as Chris just said, if somebody says, I don't want to work any Saturdays, you probably had a certain feeling of what a person that would ask that would be like. Now notice the difference if I say, Dr. Reaver, Saturday is a very important day in my religious practice. I would be more than happy to work extra Fridays or extra Sundays. Is there any opportunity for me to have a limited number of Saturdays so that I can engage my religious practice? That sounds totally different than like, I don't want to work Saturday, right? So that's part of the nuance here. We could probably field one more question and then I want to dive in a little bit more into salary equity, and we might have some more Q&A time at the very end.
Just our last question that we can focus on with negotiation, for those individuals who are a little bit more kind of research focused, or ultimately who want research to be a significant part of their career, but perhaps might not be starting with grant money and protected time. Do you have any advice on how they can negotiate to perhaps get more research or protected time?
Yeah, so I think that is completely different at every institution, right? So there's some institutions that are not going to provide any support for new investigators, and there's others that are investing in doing that. And so I think it's just asking that question flat out. What support do you have for someone who's coming in without a KO8 or without any grant funding? What support can you and would you be able to support me in my career as a new investigator as I'm trying to get funding? Because it's going to be different at every institution. So definitely ask those questions.
And be concrete about the what, because some things, again, are easier lift than others. So if you need a specific piece of equipment that's like a one-time capital outlay that other people might benefit from having, that's one type of ask versus, I need dedicated data analyst time or statistician time that may be, a complete different level. Now we're talking about hiring somebody in FT and things like that. So be pretty discreet about what you're looking for and understand what that particular job already can offer you. So within that confines of the unfunded grant person, understanding that promotion and tenure timelines and things like that is really important on a research pathway. So the type of instructor versus assistant professor job that you're hired into, if you're somebody who wants to pursue a research career, gets really important. because you have a certain timeline for your productivity goals in research, and you want that to be deferred until you actually have the protected time to do a meaningful amount of research. So maybe that you choose to come in as an instructor.
That brings up, yeah, I was gonna say, that brings up 2 points, that instructor versus assistant professor. Make sure you clarify that piece. The other piece that comes up a lot before you dive into compensation, but it comes up a lot and it's very confusing for new faculty members. When they talk to me about clinical FTE or their clinical time, they get very confused, and I can't tell you how many faculty have said to me, well, you're going to bring me in as a 1.0 clinical FTE, and this other institution is bringing me in as a 0.8 clinical FTE. And I'll say, well, how many weeks are you doing as a 0.8 clinical FTE at X institution versus 1.0 clinical FTE at my institution, right? And so as a 1.0 clinical FTE, they're doing much less clinical time, much less oftentimes than that 0.8 clinical FTE elsewhere, right? And so and I don't want to get into the details of all of that, but it's how the department chair or the division chief defines 1.0 clinical FTE. And I personally have chosen to define a full clinical FTE as much fewer weeks, because that makes it safe, right? Because if I say it's 0.8, anytime the chair could say, well, I'm going to take away your 0.2 from your faculty, right? So, but just ask how much clinical time it is. Don't get hung up in the defined clinical FTEs, because it's going to be very confusing. And there's a reason we do that. So what you're most interested in is, what is your clinical FTE, or how much clinical time are you going to be doing? Ask the questions of how we define it. Because like I define it as 1,600 hours, where somebody else may define it as 22 weeks plus call, right? When that's a lot more hours than, so you got to ask those questions and compare apples to apples.
Just adding to that, it's okay to ask for like an example schedule of someone that would be at your FTE to, for example, there's difference in what a weekend day is. Is it morning? Is it all day?
Yeah.
And so just because it's your way at the institution you're currently at, it might not be the same so you could make assumptions that might be different. So having that example might be helpful too.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Reaver. We're going to jump into just a quick little summary. So I have interviewed a boatload of chiefs, both in neonatology and outside neonatology, as well as a lot of newly hired faculty. And this kind of sums up a lot of the advice they've given, both in private practice and academic settings. So be likable and be honest and transparent were by far and away the most common suggestions from folks doing the hiring. And don't be afraid to ask for things in a professional way. Share the why and give example data whenever possible. And please be timely in your follow-up. And I understand there may be a little part of you that is smirking, saying, they're not that timely in their follow-up either. We're all trying our best, I promise. But particularly if a discrete timeline is given, please honor it. If something is not given to you, don't take it personally. It is not a judgment on your work. That's simply the nature of the negotiation and what's available. And remember that sometimes the things that you negotiated for in the front end of the job search are a no now, but actually they're really a not yet. So maybe that's not something you can get as a brand new faculty walking in the door, but there's an opportunity to get it a year or 2 years or 3 years down the road. When you ask people who are in the position you're in, they say, don't be afraid to stall. So don't feel so beholden to answering this offer that you're giving up another great opportunity that maybe you're still in the interview stages for. Whenever humanly possible, get things in writing. Maybe it's in the contract, that's great. Maybe it's in an email communication, and that's okay too. Remember that money is not the root of all happiness, so we will spend some time talking about it now. But that really it's the work-life integration that drives whether people want to stay or leave at a given position, and that you may want to seek a lawyer's advice. Okay, the money. So the first thing we need to acknowledge is that our field is disproportionately populated by folks who identify as women. And that nature of a given specialty in medicine is very intimately connected with pay. So specialties for whom there is a predominance of women in the specialty are amongst the lowest paid specialties in medicine. You can see us in the not honorable position at the very bottom here. Within the pediatric subspecialties, you can see the dark shaded bars on the left bigger, way less compensation than our adult counterparts, even where there is equivalence, which for neonatology there is not. But if you're adult ID versus peds ID, wildly disparate salaries. And the only shining little bit of good news is that among the pediatric subspecialties, neonatology, along with our partners in cardiology and critical care, are really the only specialties for whom doing a fellowship is actually financially beneficial. Your long-term career earnings will be higher in these three fields compared to having just gone on to general pediatrics, as opposed to all of our other incredible, important partners in medicine who are going to be paid less for having done extra training. Salary isn't everything, but it does matter, and you need to understand where these numbers come from. So I'm going to focus on AAMC data because it is the most easily available data, but understand that that reflects academic practices. Private practices in neonatology typically pay more, but there is usually a considerably higher clinical load. So I've done some back of the napkin calculations where if you just did per clinical hour worked, typically academics actually pays more when you think about it per clinical hour. But certainly there are obligations and opportunities for research, education, administrative work that is distinct from most private practice jobs. So think of this, if you're looking at private practice opportunities, as sort of the lower end of the scale, and then go up from there. A few caveats on the AAMC data to be aware of. This is 2022 data. The 2023 will be coming out soon. These are all medical school affiliated jobs, so either housed within the medical school, university, hospital, or a partner hospital, children's hospital. And almost everyone participates. This is total compensation data, which does not include benefits. And this reflects a full-time salary member. So it does not account for the fact that if people are working part-time, they are paid less. And this data is available by region, gender, race, and ethnicity. What I'm going to show you is presented as the median, the 25th percentile, the 75th, and the mean for a given rank. And that's really important to understand when you're looking at this data, and maybe you've seen a data point or you take a picture of this. Understand that everyone in an assistant professor rank includes all the people who just got hired and all the people who have been an assistant professor for 7 to 10 years. So you shouldn't expect to be paid at the median, or certainly not the 75th percentile for a rank, when you are 0 years in that rank. Okay. So here's an example of neonatology overall, and then specifically in the central region. So you can see that the 25th percentile, which is a good benchmark to have in your mind, again, because you're coming in at 0 years experience, is about $234,000, and the median is $264,000. There is some region specificity. So as compared to the 25th percentile, 234, in the central region, it's 246. And so you will see differences between job offers if you're looking at a broad geographic representation. Now, I want you to really let this information soak in here. Understand that these numbers are smaller. And this is the first year, so we do not have trends for this data. But I hope that you see right away that we have a striking problem in our field in salary equity. Understand that this is not a factor of the fact that women work part-time more, or women are seeking positions in community hospitals more, or any other decision that we are consciously making about the type of job that we are pursuing. In this particular study, they looked at a very narrow subset of physicians. These were all brand new early career physician researchers on a tenure track pursuing NIH funding. And what they find is from the very first hire, there's already a $20,000 per year pay gap between folks who identify as women and folks who identify as men. And it's even higher when you consider the racial pay gap. So all this whataboutism is actually really elegantly deconstructed in this particular study that takes all those factors into account. That means that over the first 10 years from your postgraduate training, there are hundreds of thousands of dollars of lost opportunity for women relative to men. And if you invest that, that difference becomes even more dramatic. So I thought maybe Eric popped in the chat if you're here. Hello, and thank you for this paper. So Eric Horowitz and Renan Savage and their collaborators put this effort together specifically for neonatologists. And what they've demonstrated here is that there's a difference of about $35,000 per year in salary. And that the second biggest driver of how much you get paid after being the boss was actually just being a man. more important than what type of setting you practice, how much administrative work you do, how far into your career you are, and where you're practicing. And that difference compounded over an entire career and invested returning a conservative 6% means $3.5 million of difference. So, mitigation strategies. You will see most of the literature talking about individual actors and what we should be doing to address this. And you will see a lot of data about the problem with women in negotiation. But I will urge you to think of this as a system problem. But what does the data say? The data is that it's not that women are ineffective negotiators, it's that they are choosing not to negotiate or limiting the things for which they are negotiating. So 20% of women are not negotiating at all. And men are 4 times more likely than women to negotiate. When it comes to seeking opportunities, women also set a much higher bar to pursuing those opportunities. So a man will typically apply for a job when he feels he has met 60% of the qualifications for that position, whereas women will wait well beyond when they met 100% of qualifications. And there's similar data even in things like promotion and tenure, which in an academic medicine career represents some of the biggest jumps in your salary. So if you wait until you have met 120% of the qualifications for promotion and tenure, you have left a lot of money on the table. So know your numbers and negotiate. One very interesting finding is that the practice makeup in terms of gender balance actually significantly correlates with the gender pay gap. So if you are in a practice where more than half of the people are women, irrespective of whether the person in charge of the practice is a woman or not, there is more salary parity than if the preponderant members of the group are men. So keep that in mind when you're looking at different practices. But I would urge you to consider this as everyone's problem. So it shouldn't just be women being willing to come to the table to negotiate. Every single person should be asking at every job interview, how does this practice, how does this institution promote salary equity? And you should care what the answer is. We are all part of changing the system. Okay. I'm going to stop with the content here and offer another opportunity with our last 12 minutes together to make sure that your questions are being addressed, since that's the most important part of us being here today. But I hope I have left you a little angry in a good way, because that will spawn action.
That was some great data, Liz. Eye-opening, and even though I've heard a lot of it before too, still with great presentation of it. I think the only one I got there, which you just kind of hit on a bit, was the question was how do we use this data to approach equity and salary, especially if salary is usually non-negotiable. And I think you hit on it a bit with just asking how it was actionable, but I didn't know if you could expand any more for that question.
Yeah, again, there are so many facets that are going to go into picking a job. But to me, the bottom line is always about value alignment. So to me, what has brought me to the jobs that I have taken and what has kept me in the positions happily are my values aligning with the goals of the institution. So I'm not saying you pick up or leave a job based on the answer to that question, but to me personally, it's wildly important. So knowing that people are actively looking at salaries, that they have made adjustments where they have found some potential inequities, that this is an annual review process, those kinds of answers are very important to me in this process. And there's no one way to do this, but knowing that somebody is attending to it is really important. And I appreciate the transparency when you say, okay, we have done a salary equity review, and what we have found, there are some what you would call inequities, and here are the reasons why. For example, this person gets paid, not naming names, but we are going to pay a person who has dual fellowship training differently than somebody who has traditional training, right? Or we have a particular need for program development. This person has done a 4th-year fellowship, and that's something that we highly prioritize. And then, as you would expect, somebody with more experience is going to be different than somebody coming fresh out of fellowship for salary, and that should be the case. It makes sense.
I think there's 2 layers to that question, and I think it's very fair as a new faculty member coming in to say, how do you address inequity, or how do you address making sure that your faculty have equitable salaries, right? And I would be very happy to answer that question, not only in my division chief role, but also in my vice chair role, right? So I think that those are fair questions to ask. There are nuances. So as you get further along though, right? And I have inherited faculty who came in and very aggressively before my time negotiated high salaries, right? Well, I can't come in and go, I'm taking your salary away, nor can I bring everybody else up to where this person really negotiated aggressively for some reason with previous chiefs. My point being that when you get to a different level beyond that initial faculty member, you should pay attention to what Liz just said and make sure you're negotiating what you're worth, right? Apply for those jobs, even if you feel like you don't check all the boxes in terms of your experience, because you still could get that job. And if the answer is no, if you don't try, and then make sure you're negotiating fairly. And the best thing I ever did is when I was negotiating for a job, I got a lot of people to weigh in and say, what do you think I should come back at? What should I negotiate? What should I think about? And if I hadn't done that, I would not have had a lot of the opportunity that I do now. Not only in salary, but in resources and other pieces and parts.
I just want to reemphasize that negotiation is not a one-time thing. As I said, you will continue to negotiate throughout your career. So maybe your practice changes, it acquires a new location. And now everyone is going to have to do a little bit different clinical work. There's sort of a negotiation inherent in that conversation. If there is a need to fill a position, we need somebody to be a medical director or a fellowship director or there's a negotiation of how to navigate that change, right? How does this impact things like my clinical time? And what are the deliverables that you are hoping to see me achieve in this new position? Is there a salary component to that new opportunity? So building a great portfolio of negotiation skills is going to benefit you tremendously in the long term. So a plug for all of the national conferences that have fellow specific content that include leadership content. Negotiation is frequently featured. As you go on to your attending life, if you have opportunities to attend leadership conferences, things like the AANC Early Women's Leadership Conference, a lot of those include negotiation skills as part of the curriculum.
Well, I think we're running a kind of up to our time. I have one final question I thought would be a great question to end with. I'll put up our QR code for our post-session evaluation while you guys are answering this. But the question I thought would be great to end with would be, if you guys could go back to right after you were getting your first jobs out of fellowship, what advice would you give to yourself in terms of contracts and negotiation?
So I'm not going to name names, but somebody suggested that I negotiate with the chair, and I didn't even ask to clarify. So I had a very humorous conversation with my chief, who was like, "Why'd you go over my head with this negotiation?" And I was like, "Sorry, I must have misunderstood the process." So make sure you know who you're supposed to be negotiating with. That would be the main thing. I think I would have asked more of these systemic equity types of questions. I think my savvy in this space has changed a lot since I was taking the first job. And I think I had the benefit of having some offers to think about, and also the tremendous insider scoop, because I did wind up staying where I did my training. So I knew a lot of the newly hired faculty. We had hired a lot too in that season. So I had a pretty good idea of what people were coming in with and what they were getting and what equity would look like in that sense, so that I wasn't, asking for things that would be somewhat unreasonable potentially. That's sort of my reflections on the process. And it is wildly different now at a different stage in my career, where people are looking for me for specific roles, right? And they're looking for a specific skill set, and my negotiation opportunities look completely different.
Yeah, and I would say, I had the perspective of, at the time, I was a basic science researcher and wanting to come in, with a basic science lab. And so for that specific type of job, you have got to have a mentor or somebody who helps you negotiate those pieces and parts. You don't know what you don't know. And you really do need somebody at the institution where you're going and at your current institution to really help you navigate what your ask should be from a research standpoint and in your needs. But so I think my best advice for that type of position is to have really lean in on your mentors. And I think that's true though, even for a clinical job. Talk to your faculty. You guys are all surrounded by incredible academic faculty. Talk to your faculty and, you know, find these people. I know you don't want to say, hey, I'm looking for another job if you're already, you know, but find folks that you can trust even in other institutions and just have a conversation with them. And I talk to people all the time about, hey, I'm thinking about this job. What do you think? And how would you negotiate? And what should I negotiate for? So just take advantage. We are a very tight-knit, small community in neonatology. So take advantage of that. Take advantage of women in neonatology. There's a lot of great people and women in neonatology who would be happy to help a lot of you. And then of course, this TECaN group also is a great resource.
Well, thank you for that. That was, you guys provided just wonderful advice today. I wish I had this when I was in the fellow shoes as well. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to put it together and be with us here today. So thank you to Liz and to Chris for all your advice, and to Morgan for moderating along with me, and to Nicole for organizing the whole series. So with that, we appreciate you all, and let us know in the in our post-session evaluation how we did and how we can improve for next year.
Thank you, and best wishes. This is super stressful, but it's also a really fun experience to be able to see all of these great institutions and practices, and to finally feel like you've moved on to this next phase of life. It's exciting.
And take advantage of the opportunity to see different sites and meet all these faculty that are at these sites. It's a great opportunity. So it's exciting, and enjoy the process. As stressful as it is, try to enjoy the process.